Alhamdulillah, ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah. Praise be to God. I bear witness that there is no God but God and He has no partner. One statement that every submitter is familiar with is the statement, happiness is submission to God alone. This statement is a very important statement, because as we all know that every human being's desire is to be happy now and forever. We all seek happiness through different means and ways. Nobody would say that I want to be sad sometimes. Most people want only happiness. So eternal happiness and joy is something that our soul desires. And there's nothing wrong in it. You should desire for happiness and joy and contentment and peace in your life. And it is something that God promises the believers also. The believers will be given joy, happiness and contentment. So the question is how we achieve it. And we know through our many years of being in submission that happiness can only be achieved through total submission to God alone. However, we need to, now that we have spent considerable years, I think many of us here in this room have spent considerable amount of years in submission. So when we first heard this statement, we understood it to some extent, and it has been a great information for our growth. But as we progress more into submission and spend more years as a submitter, and we learn the Quran, I believe that it never ends. We learn more, the more experiences. And that's the beauty of submission. Submission is not just about reading a book and learning something from it. Many of the things in the Quran, we only learn through experience. We don't learn by simply sitting together and reciting verses. We learn to some extent, but we will not go into the depth of it until we pass through certain life stages. Many instructions in the Quran that speaks about, let's say family life, let's say children, let's say parents, let's say health, wealth, all these things. So we all go through this in our lives, and when we go through this life, we start to understand, so this is why God says do this or don't do this. Things start to make a lot of sense to us. So things that we may have been reading for months and years, we have a different level of understanding as we go through that in life. So that's the reason why God says to continuously read the Quran, because you get more and more perspectives as you progress in life. A child learning the Quran right now may have certain understanding, but when they grow up and become an adult, then the understanding goes to another level. And then they go into maturity, which is the age of 40, and they have another understanding. Then many life instances go through children, marriage, parents getting old, many things. So that is, but in every stage of our life, we have this one desire, one calling inside our hearts to be happy. This is something that we all desire deep down, right? But submission is the only way through which that happiness, true happiness, peace and contentment can be achieved. This is the truth and the absolute truth. There's no other way. So first, to understand what happiness is and how we can achieve it, we need to look at the most important words in that particular statement, and that is submission to God alone. So what is submission? There are many verses in the Quran that gives us an idea or that teach us what submit means. And these verses give us a particular idea of how to achieve that happiness also. We know that many prophets and messengers before us actually prayed to God to make them submitters, Muslimin. And this in Surah 2 verse 128 we see. Abraham praying to God, "Our Lord, make us submitters to you, and from our descendants let there be a community of submitters to you. Teach us the rights of our religion and redeem us. You are the Redeemer, most merciful." So a submitter is someone who is by default happy. A submitter is someone who is by default happy. Now when we say this, some submitters or some people may think, but I'm not always happy. Well, that means you have a lot more work to do. That's what it means. Because a submitter is someone who is by default happy. And inshallah we'll get to it, because God says in another verse that you shall submit a total submission. So that means there is some level, there is a degree of submission. That is the reason why God is saying that absolutely you have to submit. There should be no part of you where there is some other elements in your belief that you have not submitted. So complete submission is through which you achieve happiness. So God teaches us that submitters of the past, messengers and prophets of the past, they even prayed to God to make them submitters. Because without God's help, you cannot become a true submitter. Without God's help. God has to guide you, God has to teach you, God has to let you go through certain experiences. That is when you perfect your submission. Your submission doesn't become perfect in one day. In Surah 2, verse 131, God gives us an example of how a submission, the actual state of a believer is. When his Lord said to him, "Submit," he said, "I submit to the Lord of the universe." So you see the people, the believers of the past, they were so readily, eagerly willing to submit to God, because they knew that's how they can achieve eternal life, happiness, both happiness in this world and the hereafter. Moreover, this is Surah 132, the very next verse. Moreover, Abraham exhorted his children to do the same. See? Why would Abraham do that? Because he knew that's the best place to be. That's the only way you can have a happy life. Exhorted his children to do the same, and so did Jacob. "O my children, God has pointed out the religion for you. Do not die except as submitters." And God says also in Surah 3 verse 17 that there are certain characteristics of a believer, and that they are steadfast, truthful, submitting, charitable, and meditators at dawn. So this is also a characteristic of a believer. A believer is someone who willfully submits. They know that their happiness depends on it, so they willfully submit. They have no objection. The opposite of submission is objection, resisting something. That I don't need this, or this is not me, this is not what I want it this way. Why is it not happening this way? This is all objection. So submission is the exact opposite of it. So when you reach that state of thought process where you submit to the will of God, that is when you experience happiness. So this is a very important piece of information, because if you are not experiencing happiness in any aspect of your life, this should tell you that there are certain things that you need to submit to. Certain aspects of your soul are still egoistically objecting to something. So that is why you are experiencing it. And God will try to fix those things within you. So as you submit, you start experiencing happiness. And this is what God teaches us to say to others also. If they argue with you, then say, "I have simply submitted myself to God, and I and those who follow me." You shall proclaim to those who receive the scripture, as well as those who did not. Would you submit? If they submit, then they have been guided. But if they turn away, your sole mission is to deliver this message. God is seer of all people. So again, even the messengers of God declare to their people that I have simply submitted myself to God. You see? So submitting means they do not object at all. They do not object against what God intends to do. They simply submit. So when you're submitting to things, there's no reason for you to be unhappy. There's nothing to resist. Why does suffering happen? Because there's something to resist. You're going against something. You don't like something. I don't like this. And if it is something that you need to change, you change it, it will bring you happiness. But if it is meant to be like that, no matter what you do, it will not change. And therefore you will have suffering, because you're constantly trying to change something that God intends not to be changed. So if they submit, then they have been guided. So God says that submission is a sign. If a person submits to the will of God, then that means that person is guided. Misguidance is what causes us to resist or object to what God intends to do or God wills. But if they turn away, your sole mission is to deliver this message. God is seer of all people. So if you look at the rejectors of the truth also, it is God's will that God, brought out the miracle of the Quran, the math miracle of the Quran, to test those who are the disbelievers, to increase the faith of the faithful, etc. So people may ask, why? Why? I don't need it. And why did God take so many years, so many centuries? Why not before? Why didn't God revealed it then and there that 2 verses were added to the Quran? Why did he have to wait all the way till 1974? This happened centuries ago. These statements, these very statements goes against submitting to God. It is actually resisting God, objecting to something. And where does the objection come from? Your ego. Your ego constantly objects to things. I don't like this. Why is that guy cutting me off? Why is that guy talking to me like this? I don't like the house, or I don't like my this, whatever. You're all constantly objecting to things. And when you object, naturally you'll have stress. You're stressed, you're irritated, you have the state of pain and suffering. We can see in Surah 3, even to Mary, God reminds her, O Mary, you shall submit to your Lord and prostrate and bow down with those who bow down. And God also teaches us in Surah 3 verse 83, are they seeking other than God's religion when everything in the heavens and the earth has submitted to Him, willingly and unwillingly, and to Him they will be returned. So as you can see, God says that, are you seeking something else, some other religion? Submission is the true religion, and that's the true path, that's the only path. So God's saying, if you're seeking something else, you should know that everything in the heavens and earth has submitted to Him. They're all submitters. They are not objecting to what God has decided, what He has willed. They have submitted. The mountains, the trees, they're all following God's laws without objection. The tree does not decide one day that it will not absorb carbon dioxide. Instead it will absorb oxygen. It doesn't decide. It has totally submitted to God's law that it will only take carbon dioxide and release oxygen. So this is what God is teaching us. So only creature that has the capability of objecting and submitting is the human being. So, and God tells us that the true religion is the religion wherein every person submits to the will of God. In Surah 4 verse 125, God teaches us, who is better guided in his religion than one who submits totally to God? So if you submit yourself completely to God, that means you are guided. Because that's the whole purpose of religion, is to submit yourself to God completely. Totally to God leads a righteous life according to the creed of Abraham monotheism. God has chosen Abraham as a beloved friend. In Surah 6 verse 14, we see, shall I accept other than God as a Lord and Master when He is the initiator of the heavens and the earth, and He feeds but is not fed? Say, I am commanded to be the most devoted submitter and do not be an idol worshipper. So all of God's messengers and messages that have come in the past and what we have today is all telling us to submit totally to God alone and to be devoted in that submission and never be an idol worshipper. So as these verses clearly teach us that as believers we have to submit, totally submit to the will of God. Why? Because only through that we can achieve absolute happiness. So experiencing happiness is reserved for such individuals. If you are not experiencing happiness of some kind, question your submission. Self-examine. You are resisting something, you are objecting to something which God intends to happen. That is where you experience suffering, pain and displeasure. Basically, you are not happy. If you look at many people around us, you would see this. Very angry, unpleasant people. Why? Because the same thing is happening. They are resisting to everything that is happening around them. So if they are in a state of objection, quite naturally they will be angry, they will be frustrated. So that is you cannot see a believer who's constantly angry. We see that in the video of where Dr. Shad Khalifa said, you have no business getting angry. It's so true. Because that means you're objecting to something that God is doing, basically. So that is a very powerful video, and when we read the Quran, we get a deeper understanding of what that means. Inshallah, we'll continue in the next khutbah. Thanks. Alhamdulillah, ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah. Praise be to God. I bear witness there is no God but God, and He has no partners. So now we know from all those verses that we have to submit to the will of God, and objecting to it causes unhappiness, and happiness is only achieved through submitting to God. So, but what does submitting to the will of God means? How can I submit to the will of God? That is the thing that we need to examine in the Quran. There are many instances where God has mentioned things about His will. For example, in Surah 3 verse 176, do not be saddened by those who hasten to disbelieve. They never hurt God in the least. Instead, God has willed that they will have no share in the hereafter. They have incurred a terrible retribution. Now this is will of God. Certain souls, God has willed that they will not be guided. Okay, and this certain souls could be maybe your own children, maybe your own spouse, maybe your own parents, and that can be a very painful thing to deal with, because they are very close of your kin, right? So, but God is saying, do not be saddened by those who hasten to disbelieve. God is saying that don't be saddened by it. It is my will. So, if you are constantly saddened by it, and you are constantly trying to somehow guide them into submission, what are you doing? You are objecting to what God has willed. And as a submitter, you will understand eventually that this is what God wills, because nothing will work. So once you submit to that, so the more you try, the more rejection you face, the more hostility you face. Therefore, you will not be a happy person, obviously, because you are exposing yourself to a very negative person who God has willed that He will not guide that person. So quite naturally, you are resisting something, and that is going to create unhappiness. So God is reminding us, instead, God has willed that they will have no share in the hereafter. So if God has willed that they will not have a share in the hereafter, who are we to make sure that they have a share in the hereafter? We can't do it. We can't go against the will of God. So this is something that God is teaching. This is how we submit to the will of God. Always examine what is the will of God. If God has willed that this has happened, then we submit to it. Everything is happening in accordance with God's will. And that is what it means by God is doing everything. You see? Another example where God teaches us in Surah 4 verse 90. Exempted are those who join people with whom you have signed a peace treaty, and those who come to you wishing not to fight you nor fight their relatives. Had God willed, He could have permitted them to fight against you. Therefore, if they leave you alone, refrain from fighting you and offer you peace, then God gives you no excuse to fight them. Again, God is teaching us that had God willed, He could have permitted them to fight against you. So this is another example of what it means by God is doing everything. Even the enemy fighting you is in accordance with God's will. So that's why there is another verse where God says you may dislike fighting, but it is better for you. Why? Because it is God's will, and you submitting to it, leaving your homes and striving in the cause of God is what is best for you. So again, there are people being put to test whether they will submit to God's will, God's decision, or they will object to it. In Surah 6 verse 35, God teaches us, if their rejections get to be too much for you, you should know that even if you dug a tunnel through the earth or climbed a ladder into the sky and produced a miracle for them, they still would not believe. Had God willed, He could have guided them unanimously. Therefore, do not behave like the ignorant ones. So, God is telling the messenger here that if their rejections what happens to us when people reject submission? When we talk to some people that we really care about and we are trying to teach them submission, and when they reject us, they call us munafiq, you are misguided and all those things. What happens to us? We get agitated. So when we get agitated, God is telling us if their rejection gets to be too much for you, you should know that even if you dug a tunnel. So basically, when someone treats you that way, it is an immediate information for you. God is teaching us through these verses that God has willed that they will not be guided. So had God willed, He could have guided them unanimously. So if all circumstances or everything, all your efforts are going towards that person not believing in submission, then that is what you should do as a submitter, is submit to that. Accept that this is what God wills. Do not push it too hard. Even the messengers were not allowed to do it. And God said that even if you dug a tunnel through the earth or climbed the ladder, if you show the most unusual miracles and signs to them, they would still not believe. So that's why? Because nobody can believe against the will of God. Only God can guide people. Similarly, in Surah 6, 107, had God willed, they would not have worshipped idols. We did not appoint you as their guardian, nor are you their advocate. Now you will also see on the flip side, the idol worshippers trying to justify their idolatry. In Surah 6, 148, the idol worshippers say, had God willed, we would not practice idolatry, nor would our parents, nor would we prohibit anything. Thus did those before them disbelieve until they incurred our retribution. Say, do you have any proven knowledge that you can show us? You follow nothing but conjecture, you only guess. So this is another thing that the idol worshippers do. They justify their idolatry by saying that God willed that we became idol worshippers, so it has nothing to do with us. Had God not willed it, we would not practice idolatry. But it is because of their own state, their own mind, their own decision to not submit to God and set up idols beside Him, that they were allowed to become idolaters. In Surah 7 verse 176, God says, had He willed, He could have elevated him therewith, but He insisted on sticking to the ground and pursued His own opinions. So this is an example of how certain individuals insist on sticking to their own ground, their own position. They will not, no matter what God does, they will not change. So what happens? Eventually God will let them go in their own choice. Thus he is like the dog, whether you pet him or scold him, he pants. Such is the example of people who reject our proofs. Narrate these narrations that they may reflect. So all these verses, what is it teaching us? It is teaching us that our true happiness can only be achieved by submitting to God. Many of these examples where we see that people are objecting to what God is doing, it creates suffering, it creates pain, it creates a lot of rejection and animosity between individuals. So submission, as we can see, is the secret to happiness. Submission to God alone. Total submission to God alone. So this is something that we can use to always check our state of. If we are not happy with something, we have to always examine. We are not submitting to the will of God. That is why we are experiencing. That's why we are stressed. We are angry. We are dissatisfied. Because God has willed something and we are not submitting to it totally. It is a process. There is no switch for submission where you can just switch it on and then switch it off. There's no switch like that. It is something that you eventually understand through life experiences. That yes, I have to submit to the will of God to be happy. There is no other way. So this is same like you deciding to go out on a holiday and then suddenly something happens and it's blocked. Your natural reaction would be to say, oh, why did this happen now? And then you're angry and frustrated, and whatever or whoever caused that objection or obstruction to what you wanted to do is now your enemy number one. This is a big headache. Why did this happen? And so you're objecting. So that creates suffering. So when that suffering happens, you take bad decisions. Naturally, when you're angry and frustrated, most of the 99% of the time, you'll take a bad decision. You will be very hostile to others because you're constantly objecting to what God has done. So, and the other thing that we need to understand is that God's will is always fair and it is the best. That is how we can only submit. Many people submit in a particular way. I submit to this, but they are frustrated. They are like, I don't have a choice, so I'll just accept it. That's not how you submit to God. That is not submission at all. Submission is that you cheerfully submit. You cheerfully accept. That is why God says that they cheerfully give charity. Because if we like it our way, we want to give everything to ourselves. But somebody will think, oh, I'm a Muslim, I have to give it, and people will think something about me, so I give it. That is not submission. You have to cheerfully give your money away. Because you know that submitting to God is the best thing. Whatever He wills is the best thing. So you happily submit to God's will. Not by like, I have no other choice, I put my hands up, okay, whatever. That is not submission. That is not submission at all. A lot of people think that is submission. Like giving up. But that's not submission. Submission, God does not arm twist anyone into submission. He doesn't force anyone to submission. You have to willfully submit by understanding that there is wisdom in whatever is happening here, and therefore it is for your best. You may require a job now, but you don't get it. So you're not going to be a very happy camper. You're going to be very upset. But if that's the will, then you submit it and accept it cheerfully and live your life accordingly. Good things will happen to you, because all these things are to test you how strong your submission is. So may God guide us and help us in submitting totally to God alone, and continuously guide us in checking our own objections in life, the egoistic objection that we raise in our life, so we can eliminate them one by one and achieve total submission to the will of God. Akim Salam.